and welcome everybody. It would be nice if we were in person in the Whitley, and hopefully in some months we will be there. So this is Zoom is second best, but you know what nice thing about second best? Second best is the next thing to being first best. And so it's another way of being together. And so welcome to this this lecture series. In terms of a format, what I suggest is we're, the radical schedule is 2 hours. I'm not sure we'll go that long, but I'll speak for about 50 minutes or 55 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and just see where it goes from there. And so, and when, as they say in pedagogy, when it's over, it's over. Okay, I want to split the screen to, I'll introduce this before I split the screen. The theme for our 3 weeks is quiet prophecy. That's kind of almost an oxymoron. Quiet prophecy. I said another kind of protest for social and religious transformation. And I'll tell you where I get the idea from. During my MA studies, I was lucky twice to have the remarkable scholar and human being Raymond E. Brown as my professor in scripture. And Brown, as you know, wasn't just one of the great scripture scholars of the last generation. He was also a great man. There's something about Raymond Brown that he stood out in every kind of way. So he was a man you just deeply, deeply trusted. And at one time, he was about 70 years old when he was teaching us. And he was gentle, strong, but gentle. And at one point, Brown said this. He says, when you're young, we were talking about protest and causes. And he said, when you're young, he said, you really need to be out there. He said, when you're young, it's important. We be protesting for justice and so on. He said, but there comes a time, he said, maybe my age, maybe when you're 70, he said, where it's time to park your placards, all the protest signs, he said, and pick up a basin and towel the way Jesus did at the Last Supper. It's time for another kind of protest. And I like his image, and we're gonna tease that out at some depth next week. How you park your placard, which is open protest, and you pick up the basin and towel and you move towards quiet protest. So that's going to be our theme. I want to split the screen and a little patience with this. I'm getting there. So quiet prophecy, another kind of protest for social and religious transformation. This is the plan. Tonight, I want to talk about Christian prophecy, period. Just what is prophecy and what are some principles for prophecy? And then next week, we'll look at the heart of this, quiet prophecy. How do you park your placard and pick up the basin and towel, and what does that mean? And then on the 24th, I want to talk about hope. Hope is the basis for all genuine prophecy. I'll introduce that a little bit tonight, but just as a teaser, but it's worth a whole evening. So that's the menu. Tonight, principles for Christian prophecy. Next week, quiet prophecy. 2 weeks from now, hope as the basis for all genuine prophecy. When you go to church, they have what liturgists insist, we call it, so we used to say entrance hymns, but they used to call gathering hymns. And that's a good expression. The hymns that gather us in, that give us some theme. So I just want to read you some quotes. If we were in church, we'd be singing a hymn. So in place of a hymn, I just want to read you some quotes on prophecy. And all of these are taken from Daniel Berrigan, whom I'll introduce to you later. Berrigan says, I know that the prophetic vision is not popular today in some spiritual circles, but our task is not to be popular or to be seen as having an impact, but to speak the deepest truths we know. We need to live our lives in accord with the deepest truths we know, even if doing so does not produce immediate results in the world. And this is the great line at the end. The good is to be done because it is good, not because it goes somewhere. You know, we stand up for truth, we live certain principles and so on, not necessarily because the world's going to believe it, not necessarily we're going to even change the world. You do the good because it's good for its own sake. Then he said, I draw from the prophets a very strong bias in favor of the victim and a very strong sense of the judgment of evil structures and those who run against them. The prophets in Christ talked about God, about the God who stands at the bottom with the victims and with the widows and orphans. When they find this later, widows and orphans in Scripture, and witnesses with them in the world. From that terrifying vantage point, which is like the bottom of the dry well that Jeremiah was thrown into. And just a couple more. He says, the best way to be hopeful is to do hopeful things. Then he says, how can those who honor themselves, us, allow others to be dishonored? You know, why we need to be prophetic. Then I'm going to come back on this one several times tonight. Peace will not be won without the moral equivalent of loss and suffering and separation that war itself is exacting. You know, Berrigan was very much influenced by Thomas Merton. And Thomas Merton was the first person who put out a literature where Thomas Merton says, you know, countries wage war. And he says, peace has to be waged. Peace doesn't just happen. He said, the same way, you know, peace has to be waged. You have to wage peace. It's got to be an active thing. It's not a passive thing that's going to happen, you know. But also they said, in war, people die. There's blood. He said, it's going to exact that from us, you know. If war takes lives to wage war, waging peace is also going to cost lives. Then this one, and I'm going to try to come back on this one several times because this is such a big issue today. How to love one's enemy even while one's life stands in opposition to him. You know, I look at this country right now. It is so deeply, deeply divided, you know, so that, you know, and for instance, everything now is bipartisan. Partisan. It's just simply people can't stand each other, you know. So how do we love? Because you're going to see prophecies about love. How do we love across those lines, you know? Remember Wendy Wright when she spoke here some years ago, and she said, you know, like when you look at somebody that you really don't want to be in a room with, and you say, what does love mean now? What does it mean to love this person? And then again, the payment for birth is blood. When a baby's born, there's blood. The cost of rebirth, Berrigan says, cannot be cheap. So there's just some gathering hymns. We're not. I want to begin with what is a prophet? We're looking at tonight non-negotiable principles for Christian prophecy. What is a prophet? Well, you know, in our common parlance, certainly in English, in French, I'm not sure about Spanish and Italian and so on, but certainly in English, in popular parlance, prophets somehow have the idea that they're like fortune tellers, or they somehow foretell the future, you know, prophesy and so on. Well, that has nothing to do with prophecy. You know, that's fortune telling. You know, quite simply, a prophet doesn't foretell the future. A prophet doesn't foretell the future. A prophet properly names the present. You know, but they name it in terms of how they see it through. If God were here, how would God name this? And later on, we're going to look at that already tonight. There's a lot of sloppy naming. You know, today, you know, like first of all, liberals and conservatives name it exactly the opposite of each other. Who's right, and so on. But a prophet properly names the present moment, and oftentimes it's in terms of a lament for the poor, because the poor are always getting shafted from the beginning of time to this very day. So prophets, when they name the present moment, they're often naming the fact that the poor are getting screwed in the present moment, and so on. So they properly name the present. But I want to give you just one wonderful biblical example of this, from John's gospel, and that is what Mary does at the wedding feast of Cana. The wedding feast of Cana, we always have, it's a wonderful hospitality thing that Mary did and so on. Let me give you just a little background. This text is so rich. First of all, in John's gospel, Jesus is always God, pure and simple. In John's gospel, Jesus hasn't got a shred of humanity. He is God from the first line to the last line. He's walking human flesh. It begins the gospel. The beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and it became flesh. So Jesus is God. But then John does an interesting thing with Mary. In John's gospel, he never mentions her name. She's always the mother of Jesus. If we didn't have the other gospels, we wouldn't even know what Mary's name was, So in John's gospel, she's the mother of Jesus, but he's doing something with that. So in John's gospel, she's not just the mother of Jesus, she's Eve. She's our mother, so that when Jesus has a conversation with his mother in John's gospel, it works at a double level. It's Jesus talking to his mother. It's also God talking to Eve, the mother of all humanity. So when you read that the wedding feast of Cana in that line, so they said at a certain point, the mother of Jesus. Now it's interesting even how the story is introduced. They said the mother of Jesus was invited to a wedding, and Jesus also went along. So notice he's the tag along. It wasn't like he was invited to a wedding and his mother went along. He said the mother of Jesus was invited to a wedding, and Jesus went along. Okay. Then it said at the height of the feast, the mother of Jesus, doesn't call her Mary, she goes to Jesus and says, they have no wine. Just that line, they have no wine. And Jesus says, woman, which is not what you call your mother. He's addressing Eve. He's addressing the mother of humanity. He said, what's that to you and I? My hour has not yet come. But she goes and tells the stewards whatever he tells you to do. And as you know the story, they fill the jugs and he turns the water into wine. Now, there's a lot of different meanings to the story, but one of them is simply this. Mary, there in John's gospel, she is our mother. She's Eve. She's the mother of humanity. But notice she gives voice to human finitude. We don't know why there wasn't any wine, but it would have been a big embarrassment and so on. This is a pretty earthy text. They have no wine. See, she notices the need and she gives voice to it. It's prophecy. She names the moment. She names what's needed. She calls God to that moment. So that they have no wine. Now it also has a deeper meaning, not just wine at the wedding, but it's also she's at a deeper level. This is Eve, the mother of humanity, speaking to God and says, I'm at the center of this planet at a wedding where there's supposed to be the ultimate joy, and it's kind of flat down here. Because notice wine is not a protein food. She didn't say they don't have any protein. They don't have any healthy foods. They don't have any wine. Just a little simple thing. When you go to any meeting, you go to any house, you go to any kind of church, and you're in a room for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you'll know whether there's wine in the house or not. And I'm not talking about the type you drink. Sometimes the business is being done, but it's flat. There's protein, there's no wine, but at a basic level, Mary is simply giving voice to human finitude. There's always something missing. Somebody is coming up short, and the prophet names that. They have no wine. Okay, so a prophet doesn't foretell the future. A prophet properly names the present. Now, with that as a background, I want to run through principles here of what makes for Christian prophecy, because they're going to see that needs to also be separated from political. Christian prophecy can lead to political change. It can lead to, it can mix with politics, but a lot of times, causes can move, but they're not being moved by Christian prophecy. Okay, because Christian prophecy has to have these characteristics, and this is the first one, and this is the most important one of all. A prophet makes a vow of love, not of alienation. Just that. A prophet makes a vow of love and not of alienation. Let me tease that out, and I want to apologize because I'm going to use a little colorful language here and so on, but you get the picture. Some years ago, I was at a clergy thing, Oblates, and we were having some kind of provincial gathering, and the animator, bless her, she intended well. At one point, she said, now we're going to have a little ceremony. I want you all to pray for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I want you to go up one by one, and you have to speak out. What is your gift? What's the gift you bring to the community? And I always find that hard to do, so do a lot of other people. I think my gift is this, and so on. Maybe we're false humility, but anyway, I found it hard, But anyway, one of our oblates who has been in trouble from day one since he's been ordained with every bishop, with every provincial. He's out of ministry half the time and so on. And it's been in a lot of people's faces and so on. It's been suspended a couple of times. But he went up there with quite a robust thing. He says, I'm a prophet. He said, I speak prophecy. He said, I'm a shit disturber. So that's the bad word. He said, I'm a shit disturber. I get in people's faces. I'm a prophet. And I thought, no, you're a shit disturber, but you're not necessarily a prophet. See, and I deliberately used the colorful language because, a lot of times, we can be agitators. We can be people's faces. We can be shit disturbers. But if it's not coming out of love, it's not going to go anywhere. In fact, it can be counterproductive and so on. A prophet, this is tricky. Let me give you an example. We have a shrine here in our library to an oblate who was shot to death in Guatemala, Larry Rosebow. So if you go to our library, we have a shrine to him. And Larry Rosebow, who was in prison in the United States and in Brazil and in Guatemala for social protest, and eventually was shot to death in Guatemala. First of all, Larry himself was maybe the most gentle human being I've met. There wasn't an ounce of anger or bitterness or getting in your face in Larry. He was a shy, introverted, very gentle man. But he went on some protests with the Berrigans, and in fact went to prison a couple of times with Daniel Berrigan. But Larry said, this is the way we do protests. He said, the day before we did an action, and their actions were always where nobody got hurt. They would, pour blood on draft cards, or they would burn draft cards and so on. But Larry said, we would do a day-long retreat. So he said the three of us, or sometimes had a couple of women along with them, lay people, said we would do the day-long retreat. He said, then we would spend the night in prayer. Said, and in the morning, he said, we'd say mass. He said, then we'd walk from the Eucharist. He said, the priests wearing our stoles, we'd walk in and we'd do this act. And he said, Daniel always said, he said, Larry, if you can't do this and without hating the people who are going to arrest you, he said, then don't do it. Don't do it. He said, the world doesn't need another angry man. He said, you need to do this out of love. And he said, we were always careful that nobody got hurt, that nobody got fired, that nobody lost their job, and they would do radical acts, which just send them to prison. But it was always, it's got to be out of love. And in fact, that line I quote from Daniel Berrigan, a prophet makes a vow of love, not of alienation. So, and that's easily confused. There's a lot of, excuse the expression again, shit disturbers out there. If it's not coming from love, it's not prophecy. Now, it also makes, it's a critical distinction here between operating out of egoism and operating out of faith and hope. The little quote I give you from below from Berrigan, he says, when is resistance a mature response to systems and powers that claims our lives? And when does it become a petulant form of egoism? If it doesn't come out of love, it soon becomes a form of egoism. And then he said, a prophet risks misunderstanding, but they never seek it. See, a lot of people want to be agitators. Jesus never tried to agitate people. He just preached love, and it got him in trouble. Or even Gustavo Gutierrez, whom we proudly gave an honorary doctorate to, the father of liberation and theology. Gutierrez says, in my books, He said, in my books, I used the word love 7 times for every time I used the word justice. See, you don't set out to be in somebody's face. You set out to love somebody. Now, you will be misunderstood, but you don't seek that. It's interesting. I talked about Larry Rosbaugh. He said all the years that he spent in prison, he was in Brazil on the streets, he was tortured and so on. He said, you know what the hardest thing was? He said, my parents didn't understand me. He said, my parents said they didn't want this kind of priest. They wanted a Monsignor in an affluent parish with French cuffs who was popular and liked. And he said, just my parents just never got me. I was very hard on him, but see, you don't seek to be misunderstood. You will be misunderstood. Jesus never looked for trouble. Jesus never looked to get crucified. They came and got him. Then a prophet is single-minded and can be misunderstood, but always seeks to have a mellow heart. Single-minded people can seem hard. So I'll give you an example, like somebody like Mother Teresa. She's probably not the person you want to depict to be beside at the dinner table. The conversation wouldn't have been light, So they're single-minded, just God and the poor, and they're just like a steam truck and so on. But there's always, in true prophet, there's a mellow heart. Somebody like Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King, Gandhi, these people were powerfully single-minded, but they were powerful prophets because they had a mellow heart. Okay, that's the first one. A prophet makes a vow of love, not of alienation. Then secondly, a prophet is grounded in a reality beyond this world. I want to begin with Jesus as a paradigm. Incidentally, that's a picture of Daniel Berrigan in the little block there. In Luke's gospel is preeminently the gospel of prayer. Okay, in Luke's gospel, it has Jesus praying more often than in all the other gospels put together. But also in Luke's gospel, it's the one gospel where the disciples are really, they're intrigued with Jesus' prayer. And they're intrigued for this reason. They notice there's something special about Jesus. They notice something that he's different than other people, not because they think he's God, or not because he even does miracles, because he could actually forgive enemies. He could actually turn the other cheek. He could actually love somebody who hated him, which none of us can do, and so on. But they sensed this. They sensed that he was drawing that strength from something outside. He wasn't drawing the strength from the community. He wasn't drawing the strength even from, the Jewish religious services. They sensed he was getting it from his prayer life. That in his prayer life, he was linking to his Father. And, he was drawing that strength from there. And so they're intrigued. And that's why in Luke's gospel, it's the only gospel where they ask Jesus to teach him how to pray. He gives us the Lord's Prayer. And the other gospels, he has said, sit down, I'm giving you a lesson. In Luke's gospel, they ask for it. They say, Lord, teach us to pray. We want to pray the way you pray, See, so that Jesus was always grounded in something outside of the culture, Incidentally, Daniel Berrigan, I keep using him as a prophetic figure, and he was one, But you know what Daniel Berrigan did? Daniel Berrigan said, I always grounded myself in something outside the culture. So what he did for years when he wasn't in prison and so on, he would work in a cancer hospice in New York. He'd work in a cancer hospice. And the idea is, he said, I'm working with dying people. And he said, dying people have no stake in this world. So I'm connected to people who aren't outside the culture. He said, it keeps me grounded. He said, if you don't get yourself grounded outside the culture, he said, the culture is going to eat you whole. And he's right. Our culture, both good and bad, but our culture is the most powerful narcotic that's ever been perpetrated on this planet, for good and for bad. It's hard not just to be swallowed by our culture, See, so a prophet has to draw strength from outside the culture, Berrigan always says, monks have secrets worth knowing. He said, they get up in the middle of the night and pray in the dark. He said, why did they do that? He said, maybe they're onto something, And he says, if your prophetic stance doesn't save the world, at least it might save your own integrity and sanity. So A prophet makes a vow of love, not of a nation, and it grounds himself or herself in a reality outside of this world. Then thirdly, a prophet draws his or her cause from Jesus and not from ideology. Let me tell you a story here. Some years ago, and I heard this on NPR radio. It's a great story. And it was a woman. She was an Episcopalian priest from San Francisco, who was very given over to climate change, preaching about ecology, almost like Laudate Si of Pope Francis and so on. And so she was going around the country giving talks about saving the planet and so on. Well, the interviewer asked her and said, you come from San Francisco, the West Coast, very liberal. He said, so I can see, your message. He said, how does that play out in Arkansas? How does that play out in Oklahoma and in West Texas and some places where it's not so liberal? How does your message play out there? She gave a very interesting answer and a good one. She says, well, it plays out everywhere. She said, sincere people hear the gospel. It said, and she said, whenever I'm preaching the gospel and not Greenpeace or ideology, they hear it. Said, and as soon as, I subtly somehow get into ideology and into political correctness or whatever, they turn me off like a water faucet, But she's right. Sincere people will hear the gospel. See, so our prophecy, if it's coming out of, that's the difference. I say the difference between Jesus and Greenpeace. Greenpeace does a lot of good, and it's a political movement and so on. But people can turn off Greenpeace. They can say, I don't want to hear it. They go, I don't want to hear about climate change. I don't want to hear about this. You can't turn off the moral voice of Jesus. See, so that's why it's so important that, and in fact, today, some of the things that, one of the things that's working strongly against prophecy is sometimes where we have the right cause, but we fall into political correctness and we go into ideology, and people will push you away. They will just push you away. I love what this woman said. She said, I'm learning. She said, and it keeps me honest. It's, whenever I'm doing this out of the gospel, said sincere people are hearing it. Said, as soon as I slip into ideology, however subtly, said, they turn me off like a water faucet, so that the cause is to come from Jesus, not from ideology. And it's interesting. It doesn't even have Jesus' name. It doesn't have to have Jesus' name to it. Great story. Some years ago, before I came here, when I was working in our general council in Rome, and we were doing these, we had organized what we call missionaries to secularity. How to become missionaries to our own children and so on. And in fact, we had a couple of the symposia here, but we had one at St. Paul's University in Ottawa. And one of the speakers who spoke was a French Canadian, and she was a social worker. She's a social worker on the streets of Quebec City, Vivienne Labrie. And she made quite a startling thing. She said, she says, I'm a Christian. She said, I'm a Roman Catholic. She says, and I do all this work feeding the hungry and working with people on the streets. She says, and I do it for Jesus. She said, I do it for Jesus. But she said, I can go for 3 years on the streets and not even mention Jesus' name. She said, I think Jesus is mature enough. He doesn't have to be the center of our conscious attention all the time. Now, notice that's a little bit, that's the opposite. See, she is, it looks like it's ideology, but it's Jesus. Whereas this woman from San Francisco says, I'm preaching, and there's always the danger of sliding into ideology, and it's not coming out of my faith. Said, and then people recognize it and they turn it off. Okay. Then a prophet is committed to nonviolence. I don't know if you know who this first name after, Christian Desjardins. Okay. If in 1996, there was a group of French Trappists in Algeria, and there's a very famous movie called Of Gods and Men, which won a lot of awards. And if you haven't seen it, find this movie on Netflix or rent it or whatever. Actually, you can borrow the video from me and so on. But it's a true story of these Trappists who were eventually martyred by Al-Qaeda. And in fact, all of them are up for canonization now. They're being beatified and canonized, but it's really a powerful story, a true story of these monks who they're in this village. They're doing all kinds of good work with the people who are Muslims. They're the only Christians there. And Al-Qaeda starts killing some of their own people and eventually will kill the monks. But Christian Nijad, who's their abbot, very saintly man and a very incredible man. And but at one point, the first time Al-Qaeda comes there, they come on Christmas Eve and they come with guns and they terrorize the monks, and they want to steal all the medications because the monks have a medical clinic there and so on. And first of all, he stands up to them, even though they have guns. He said, I'll talk to you, but you can't bring guns inside the monastery. So with great reluctance, actually, Al-Qaeda steps outside and they talk outside. He said, I don't want a gun inside the monastery, and so on. But then they're all terrorized, and they know these terrorists are going to come back sometime and kill them, and so on. But then this is prayer. From there on, him and the community in their prayer, this is the great paradox. They pray, Lord, disarm us. Disarm us. So they're praying in the face of arms, in the face of threat of guns. They're praying, said, keep us away from guns, keep us away from arming ourselves, make us these powerless, as Berrigan says, powerless criminals in a time of criminal power. So a prophet is always seeking to disarm. Prophets never preach violence. So a prophet is seeking to incarnate God's powerlessness. Some of you have heard this before in talks I've given, but in the Greek New Testament, there are 3 words for power, and they're always translated in English as power or authority, so we don't get the nuance, And 2 of them we have in English. They use the word dynamic. The dynamism is a kind of power. See, the dynamism of a rock star, Mick Jagger on stage or whoever, dynamism. Okay. Then they also have the power of energy. Energy is a power. Youth, health. Just the power of the middle linebacker on the football team. But it's interesting. They don't use those words about Jesus. They never say when he spoke with great power, or yes, great power, that he was dynamic or energetic. Maybe he was. We don't know. They always said he has great exousia. Now you see the word there. We don't have an English word for that, or a French word. Exousia. Exousia, we don't have a word for it, but we have a concept for it. You know who has exousia? A baby. A baby is very powerful because a baby has no power whatsoever. So I would say, if you put a football player in the prime of his career, a major rock star, and a baby in a room, who has more power? Well, they have different kinds of power. The football player could kill the other 2. The rock star can shoot the lights out with energy, but the baby lies there, is helpless, but at the end is the most powerful of all because it's a moral power. It's a power to melt hearts and so on. Babies do exorcisms. Notice people don't watch their language around rock stars or football players. They do around babies who can't even understand and so on. See, but that's how God's power is in the world. Remember when Jesus is on the cross and they're taunting him, they say, if you're God's son, show some power, get off the cross. If that had been done by Hollywood or anybody but God himself, Jesus would have got off the cross. He died on the cross. Babies don't have any power. See, so that a prophet is always coming out. It's like Daniel Berrigan said, we're powerless criminals. We don't have guns. It's interesting. Some notes on nonviolence and just war. And I wish I had a whole lot of time to go into this, but we've always had what we call pure pacifists. So Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Daniel Berrigan, people like that who say no violence ever. And partly it's not realistic. So they say we shouldn't have guns. They would be calling defund the police. Nobody should have a gun. We don't need soldiers. We don't need guns. Now that's pretty unrealistic. Or like well, I'll jump ahead to Cardinal George. Somebody once asked Cardinal George that at a conference. I found a fascinating answer. They said, what is the value of, these pacifists, prophetic pacifists, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Daniel Berrigan, saying, no guns, nonviolence, complete nonviolence, turn the other cheek. And George gave an interesting answer. He said the pacifists are to the culture, he said, what celibates are to marriage. He said, they're not realistic in this life. He said, but they point to the next life. You know what pacifists point to? To heaven. In heaven, there's going to be no guns. There's going to be no policemen. There's going to be no soldiers, and so on. See, they're already pointing to that. So it's prophetic in that sense. It doesn't mean we should defund the police, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't have cops and so on. But it means we should always be reminded that that's temporary. That's temporary. That's temporary. And in all Christian churches, right to today, we have all these arguments about, can you have a just war? And it's interesting. The Roman Catholic Church, its official doctrine is always that you can have just war, and not only can you have just war, at times you need to have just war. I remember somebody asking Skillebeck that in a class once in Louvain, and Skillebeck is a pretty liberal theologian, or was. He's died now. And they said, can there be such a thing as a just war? And they were all fully expecting Skillebeck's, this liberal theologian to say there can't be. He said, no. He said, not only can there be, there has to be sometimes. And he used that example. He said, we can't just sit by when massacres are going on and violence is being perpetrated. There's genocide. He said, the world can't just sit back and say we can't do anything. And he used his example. He said, when you're leaving class today and you're walking down the street and you see some young thug beating up somebody, he said, not only may you intervene, you have to intervene. You can't just say, well, arrangez-vous, take care of your own life, Now, it's interesting. Skillebeck's and people like Brian Hare, who's one of the great Catholic moralists, and to say, we can have just war. Now, I once asked Gustavo Gutierrez at a conference. We asked him exactly that question and said, can you have a just war? And Gutierrez says, I don't know. He said, and neither do you. And he gave a very interesting answer. And Gutierrez says, he says, you can make an argument for just war the way Skillebeck does, or the way Brian Hare does, or Catholic doctrine does. And you can make an argument for nonviolence the way Daniel Berrigan does. Daniel Berrigan says, violence solves nothing. He says, all violence begets other violence. There's no such thing of violence. You kill somebody and they're going to kill somebody. It said, all violence begets violence. So Gutierrez says, no, he said, there's no answer to it. He said, that can't be answered abstractly in an air-conditioned room. He said, what you need to do is you need to pray. He said, pray and try to really put on the mind of Christ. He said, and then when somebody breaks in your house at night, you'll react, and maybe you'll take a gun, maybe you won't. He said, but you won't know until then. So he said, there's no right or wrong answer to this. But see, pure prophets like Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, Gandhi, they point to the next world. Okay, so, but prophets are committed to nonviolence. Then a prophet articulates God's voice for the poor on the earth. Jim Wallace, the little picture of him there. Jim Wallace is our Dorothy Day, our generation's Dorothy Day. He's an evangelical out of Washington, D.C. Actually has an interesting religious pedigree. He's an evangelical. He's married to a woman who is an ordained Episcopalian priest, and he practices mostly as a Roman Catholic. So he defines himself as evangelical Roman Catholic, or married to an Episcopalian priest. He said, living Roman Catholic social doctrine. But he's a pupil of Dorothy Day, and I think today is the best articulator of prophecy for all Christian in English anyway. And he says, this is one of his words, said, any gospel that isn't good news for the poor is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just that simple. And he's right. He said, remember, because Jesus' opening statement says, I've come to bring good news to the poor. Just that. I've come to bring good news to the poor. So anything that isn't good news to the poor is not the gospel of Jesus. And that can easily be lost. You know, it's easy to slide into what we call the gospel of prosperity. You know, that somehow God is for the rich, or that if we take care of ourselves, if we're Christians, God's gonna bless us with material richness and so on. And any prophet who isn't speaking for the poor is not a prophet of Jesus. Now, who are the poor? Okay, in the Old Testament, and Jesus will use this, there's a code. The prophets say that the poor are widows, orphans, and strangers. So that's always that's code, you know, and it means the three groups at any given time. Who are the three most vulnerable groups in society? You know, who are the people who are being excluded? You know, so what I mean, that so it's code. Might not be widows, might not be orphans, might not be strangers, or it might be, but that's a code in scriptures: widows, orphans, and strangers. And it's interesting, you have a powerful prophetic mantra that the prophets articulate, which is still worth memorizing. So the great prophets say, the quality of your faith is going to be judged by the quality of justice in the land. And the quality of justice in the land will always be judged to how widows, orphans, and strangers fared while you were alive. And Jesus takes that up. Remember in Matthew 25, he said, you know what, a judgment's going to happen? The last judgment. God's going to come, set up the throne, divide people, sheep to the right, goats to the left, and there's only going to be one set of questions. Did you feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, visit prisoners, clothe the naked? Notice there's no church questions. Did you go to church? Did you keep the commandments? And so on. No, just said one set of questions. That's Jesus, you know. One time in class, I said, you know, if you were a preacher and you preached that just raw on a Sunday morning, I said, you'd be called in the bishop's office the next day. So some seminarian said, well, how did Jesus get away with that? I said, he didn't. He wasn't called to the bishop's office. They killed him for saying that, you know. But who are the widows, orphans, and strangers? Here, I'm going to give you, these two come from Gutierrez. And Gustavo Gutierrez says that widows, orphans, it's always the excluded one. Which group or people are being excluded? You know, sometimes pro-life is good at naming that, sometimes they aren't. You know, okay, abortion they're excluded ones. You know, but you know, the poor, the refugees. You know, there's this incredible line that Caiaphas, the high priest, gives when he says they should crucify Jesus. He said, we got to kill this guy. He said, it's better one person should die for the people. But that's it. That echoes in history. Whom is our society saying, you're expendable? You know, we have a certain economics and a certain lifestyle and comfort and whatever, and who may be sacrificed for this to go on? Those are the widows, orphans, and strangers. So Gutierrez says the poor are always, who is the excluded one? But then he has another one, which he gave in his speech here when he was given a doctorate. He said, the poor are those people who don't have a right to have rights. The poor are those people who don't have a right to have rights. And they know who they are. Great line again from Berrigan. He said, we've added a quality to the church that the crucified Christ never envisaged. The church compatible. Okay, number 6. And I've said that a prophet doesn't foretell the future, but properly names the present, but in function of the future. Now, what a prophet is, a prophet reads the finger of God, where the finger of God is in everyday life, in function of naming our fidelity or infidelity to God, and in function of pointing out our future in terms of God's plan for us. I want to give you just a couple of quotes here, and you'll recognize some of these people. Richard Rohr, who's also one of our prophets. But Rohr said, that's supposed to be not everything. Sorry, that's a typo. He said, not everything can be fixed or cured, but it should be named properly, correctly. You know, a lot of times you can't fix it, you can't cure it, but a prophet names it correctly. So injustice always has to be named. Something that's wrong, it has to be named, and it has to be named properly. Or James Hillman, one of my favorite philosophers, says, a symptom suffers most when it doesn't know where it belongs. Let me tell you what, to tease that out. You imagine this. See, imagine you have a backache, and it's chronic, and it bothers you, and you start worrying, my God, it might be cancer, it might be this, and so on. You see a doctor says, no, he said, that is chronic arthritis. No, it's not a pleasant diagnosis, but you know what it is. You don't have to worry anymore that it's cancer or it's something else. It suffers most. So prophets, they name something, then it's diagnostic. John of the Cross, he says, the language of God is the experience that God writes into our lives, which Jesus calls reading the signs of the times. That, okay, those are expressions where basically you're saying, if you look at any event in life, what is God saying? Where's the finger of God, for good or for bad? James Mackey, the Irish theologian, I should have typed this one out for you. I had for a course, and James Mackey says it's a question of naming divine providence. And he gave this wonderful definition of divine providence. James Mackey says divine providence is a conspiracy of accidents through which God speaks. A conspiracy of accidents through which God speaks. God doesn't cause the accidents. God doesn't cause these things. God doesn't have you win lotteries or break a leg or whatever, but God speaks through them, and we have to read that. Prophets help us read that. John Hegel, he's a diocesan priest in Seattle. He says, he's written some fine books, and Hegel says, a prophet is a meteorologist of the spirit. I like that expression. See, meteorologists, you watch the weather forecast at night, they see fronts moving in, and they can predict when it's going to rain and so on. Well, prophets, they read the spirit. But let me just tell you one quick story here about which doesn't sound very prophetic. Just it's a neat story about but reading the signs of the times. When I was still teaching in Edmonton, I had a course in religious experience, and I'd always bring for a seminar I'd bring together 10 people, and I'd kind of pick different people: Protestants, Catholics, evangelical, men, women, seminarians, lay people, married people. Gay, straight, kind of everything, so you'd always get and I did this for about 10 years, and it gets some great stories, but just give you one story, because I was always asked to take one story from your life, write it up in 2 pages, and then we're going to talk about it. Where did God speak and so on, but usually we didn't have to talk about it. As soon as they wrote it up, they saw it. So some woman, she wrote this story, it's delightful. She said, I'm an American, and she said, I grew up in the plains in Iowa. She said, Catholic family, went to church, and then said, I went to college, and slowly during my college years, I simply drifted. I simply drifted from the church. I never lost faith, but just stopped going to church, first for Sundays, and then I still go Ash Wednesday and Easter Sunday. Finally, I stopped altogether. So she said, when this story happens, I haven't been in church now for 10 years. I haven't been inside of a church. Said, and my sister was living in Colorado, and she had a baby. So I was flying out to my sister, and I was going to stay for 2 weeks, and to see my sister's baby, my new niece, but also to do skiing. Said, so I got there on a Saturday, and Sunday morning, my sister asked me to go to Mass with her, and I said, no, I don't go. I haven't gone. So it said my sister went to Mass, and I went skiing. Says, and my very first run down the hill, I hit a tree and broke my leg. Said, but now I was staying for 2 more weeks, so I got my leg in a cast. And the next Sunday, my sister asked me to go to Mass with her. Now, I haven't been to Mass for 10 years. Said, I went with her. Now, talk about a conspiracy of accidents through which God speaks. Said, it happened to be Good Shepherd Sunday, and it happened to be a priest visiting from Israel. And this was his homily. He said, there's a custom among sheep farmers in Israel, existed at the time of Jesus, still exists today. that sometimes when a shepherd notices that a lamb is born and this lamb is going to be a stray, I grew up with cattle. We could notice that with baby calves. Sometimes a calf is born, this calf is never going to stay in a fence its whole life. Said if the shepherd recognized that, he said he would take the lamb and deliberately break its leg, and then he'd have to carry it for 6 weeks while the leg healed. Said, and then he's carried it on his shoulders for 6 weeks. Says by the time the leg is healed, the lamb has become so attached to the shepherd, it'll never leave him again. She said, here I am sitting in the back of church with my leg in a cast. She said, no. She says, I'm not bright, but I'm not that stupid. She says, that happened many years ago. Said, I haven't missed Mass since. See, she read the signs of the times. She did a prophetic reading. She was a meteorologist of the Spirit. A couple of more, and then we'll stop them. And a prophet speaks out of a horizon of hope. Now, I'm going to do a full session on this, the third thing. So here I'm just going to tease you with it. See, hope should not be identified with wishful thinking or optimism. Where someone says, I hope I can win a lottery. You can't hope to win a lottery. You can wish to win a lottery. But see, wishful thinking isn't based on anything. You see, hope is. And also optimism is a natural temperament. Some people are more upbeat. Some people are more phlegmatic. Some people are more pessimistic. Some people are more stoic. That has nothing to do with reality. That's a temperament and so on. So when someone says, I'm a hopeful person because I always see the glass as half full and never as half empty. One of my friends said, I'm really an optimistic because I see the glass as refillable, which is better than even half full. No, that's a temperament. One teaser of what hope is. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, great philosopher, theologian, mystic, scientist. He was once questioned, because he had this vision of how the world is going to come together the way it's described in Scripture and so on, evolution tied to the gospel. And someone said to him, suppose we blow up the world with an atomic bomb. What happens to your little optimistic schema then? And Teilhard said this, is that if we blow up the world with an atomic bomb, that'll be a 2 million year setback. He said, but what I say is going to happen, not because I wish it. He said, because God promised it. And in the resurrection of Christ, God shows that God has power to deliver on the promise. We're going to do some work on that in a couple of weeks. See, hope isn't based on wishful thinking or optimism. It's based on a promise of God and the power that's revealed in the resurrection. And that has to fuel a prophet. Now, eighth, a prophet's heart and cause are never a ghetto. Again, I'm just going to touch these last ones, but they're important. Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer, is one of my favorite writers. He could really turn a phrase, but this is one of his says, the bosom of God is not a ghetto, but the heart of man often is. He said, God's heart is not a ghetto. And oftentimes our heart is a ghetto. So let me just switch to Jesus here. When Jesus says in John's gospel, he says, in my Father's house, there are many rooms. He's not talking about, architecture in heaven. He's talking about the size of God's heart. So in God's heart, there's room for everybody. There's room for Christians and Muslims and Jews and New Age people, and there's gay and straight and black and white, and that God's heart is universal. And see, a prophet's heart has to echo that. False prophecy always makes God your own tribal deity. And today there is so much tribalism. There's so much tribalism all around the world. Let me start with something more safe and something more dangerous. For instance, when Al-Qaeda, ISIS, when they say, let's make the Muslim world great again. Or if someone says, let's make America great again, let's make Britain great again, and so on. See, the danger is you fall into a tribalism. We're first. God somehow picks us and the others don't count. our kids are important, but this kid's, no, everybody is important, and see, so a prophet, we have a lot of tribal prophets, they want to take care of my tribe, and you're putting self-interest to the interest of one group above the common good, and that's always a sign of false prophecy. A true prophet, the good is for everyone. Okay. And then, very important, a prophet doesn't just speak or write, a prophet acts. Now, I've underlined that. A prophet acts, and acts with courage, even at the cost of death. Now, I want to pick on me and all academics here, See, a prophet is a magus who can also act. Now, the word magus is the word for an elder. It's the word for a wise man, the three magi. It's a wisdom figure, and if you're a man, you're an elder, or if you're a woman, for instance, you're a Sophia. See, wisdom figures, in all academics, we're wisdom figures and so on. Now, the problem with us is that we can write, we can speak, we can analyze, but oftentimes we can't act in this sense. Remember lectures by Robert Moore, and Robert Moore would always say, he says, when the last tree in the Americas has been cut down, he said, academics are going to have written a whole lot of studies about it, why it shouldn't be done. But he said, none of them are going to end up stopping it. See, I'm one of those. I write on this stuff. In my whole life, I've only once walked in a protest march. I'm too busy writing about it to actually do it, and so on. See, so a prophet has enough altruistic love, hope, and courage to not count the cost of prophecy, but also a prophet can act. So, Daniel Berrigan. I want to talk a little bit about the next two people, Oscar Romero. It's interesting, if you've ever seen the video or the story of Oscar Romero, it's very enlightening and can also be very challenging. See, Oscar Romero was an academic. He was a gentleman and who never rattled anybody's chain. And in fact, Rome made him a bishop for that reason. They said, we're going to put him in there. It's a testy time of politics and so on. He's this gentle man. He's this magus. He's this wisdom figure. But he was that. But when you watch what happens as he literally gets baptized by the poor and he begins to see the injustice, and you see him turning from the magus into the prophet. And so it culminates at a certain point where he stands before the president. He says, you're a liar. You're a liar, and I'm calling you on this, and you're going to shoot me and kill me, but it doesn't matter. You're a liar. And I sealed his death warrant, So this was a gentle university professor who eventually was able to act. Or Stan Rother, who actually lived at Assumption Seminary here for a couple of years before they came to OST. And he's up for canonization. He's being canonized as we, the process right now. He was a priest from Oklahoma, and he went down to Guatemala, and he was working with the poor, and he wasn't a political figure at all. And at a certain point, they began to threaten him because he was standing up for the poor, and his bishop pulled him back. He said, I don't want you killed. I don't want you killed down there. But at a certain point, Stan went back. He said, a shepherd's got to be with the sheep. And he went back, and within 1 month, he was shot to death. Andre Nouwen wrote a very fine, wonderful book on Stan Rother and so on. But notice these were maguses. They were gentle, community building, or Dorothy Stang, who died for trying to stand up for the Amazon forest and so on. These weren't radical people who were in people's faces, but at a certain point they took a stand, and in each case knowing it's going to be my death. Okay. And then, like I said, a prophet never seeks martyrdom, but accepts it if it finds him or her. Another thing you'll see in that wonderful film of the Trappist monks, all of whom were eventually martyred, but they always say, well, our first thing is to escape. We don't want to be shot. As long as we can somehow hide it or avoid it and so on. And even Jesus, they had to come and get him. Jesus didn't volunteer for martyrdom. Okay. And the last thing, and then I'll just name it because that's what we're looking at next week. A prophet can discern at which time to park the placard and bring out the basin towel. When do we stop doing the protest march? And when do we move into quiet prophecy, which I'll talk about next week, symbolized by Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So anyway, I'm going to stop the share and turn it over to Joel for questions, and we have some time now for questions and interaction.
Well, Ron, we have a couple of questions from the Q&A here. I'll begin with this one. It says that Franz Jägerstätter was an Austrian conscientious objector during World War II. Jägerstätter was sentenced to death and executed for his refusal to fight for Nazi Germany. He was later declared a martyr and beatified by the Catholic Church. And there's a question, would you consider Jägerstätter an active prophet, a quiet one, or neither?
I would consider him an active prophet in this sense, because of the time that he lived in. It's like right now we're not in wartime. We don't have a Hitler. People aren't actively saying sign up and sign this document, to show you're loyal to the, see. So today, to not do anything can be quiet prophecy. But when you say, if you don't sign this, it's like the early Christian martyrs. If you don't worship at this altar, and we're going to kill you, then that's not quiet prophecy. That's active prophecy. That's real martyrdom. See, so it's non-violent. You're not doing something, but by you refusing to do something, which gets into the face of. So it's the same as the martyrs. Say, they say, worship this, give your allegiance to Caesar, or we'll kill you. See, when you're pushed that actively, then it's no longer quiet prophecy. It's a good question, though.
Thank you. This refers back to one of your earlier slides. It was the point about a prophet drawing his or her cause from Jesus, not an ideology. And the person asks, would you say more about how we can discern if our speaking is from the gospel or from our ideology?
That's a really good question, because sometimes self-discernment can also be easily, we can deceive ourselves. I think two things, that's a complicated question. Like, how do we know? Because it's so easy to, deceive ourselves and not know. And also it's so easy to fall into ideology, because sometimes ideology can run really close to the gospel. Sometimes ideologies do really favor the poor and are prophetic and so on. Two ways. One of them is anybody who's doing this should be in spiritual direction, and you should be working with other people who help keep you, like the Berrigans, you always work with other people. They pray together and try to discern this together, but then also to read, like this woman, this woman priest from San Francisco says, I can tell by the audience, if you're astute, you realize that sometimes, or even ask the audience, why, and they'll tell you. I remember one time in Edmonton, this guy came from Ottawa and he was giving a talk at our college, and our college, Newman College, is much like OST, and he had the right cause, but he talked about, I need to be here to enlighten your conscience and your consciousness and raise your awareness and so on. Well, one of the priests took after him and he says, I find that language just insulting. He said, I would really, but basically you're saying, I'm half asleep here. And he said, and even if I am, you have to find a different way of saying this, See, and we always have to be weary of let me say something which is complicated to say. Political correctness oftentimes is correct, but we have to be careful that the rhetoric doesn't alienate, or that the rhetoric isn't seen as coming from the left or wherever. Remember a great line I heard from the bishop who ordained me, Bishop James Maddie in Saskatoon, and one time at a priest's synod meeting, he said, I'm getting a lot of complaints about women in the diocese. They're not getting equal salaries to the men. He said, and we absolutely have to change this. He said, we got to change this. And one of the priests said, Your Grace, you're just saying that because it's politically correct. And he says, it is. He said, but I'm also saying because it is correct. He said, how do we justify not paying the same money for see, so sometimes, most of the time, politically correct language, sometimes it goes too far. It is correct, but if it subtly comes out of ideology and not out of really concern for the poor or for Jesus, it's going to alienate. So, your question's a good one. How do you discern this? Well, work with other people, work with the direction, ask people, but also read your audience, and bluntly put, as this woman said, when sincere people start walking away from me, I know I'm not doing it right. Insincere people are people who are themselves caught up in ideology or in anger, can walk away from you. But when you have good, sincere people say, I can't hear this from you, then we have to look and see, am I doing this right? Okay.
Thanks, Father Ron. This refers to one of your last slides, talking about a prophet doesn't just speak or write, but a prophet acts. The person asks, how do you get out of your head and onto the street? So you're talking about Magi's and Sophia's. How do you get out of your head and onto the street?
Okay, you're probably talking to the wrong person. I've been struggling with that for 50 years, but I can answer with great difficulty. And I want to say this sympathetically. It's not that easy. I mentioned before Jim Wallace. One of the things that Jim Wallace has been able to do better than anybody since Dorothy Day, and that is Jim has been able to take the gospel to the streets. And it's not easy to do. I mean, even when you want to do it, or you want to walk in protests and so on, but how do you do it? And also, oftentimes your temperament gets in the way. If you have a temperament that's gentle and accommodating, which is wonderful, well, then it's hard for you to confront. I love this line in scripture about John the Baptist. So they said, as he grew up, he said, he grew strong in his spirit, And I often think, as I grew up, I grew ever more accommodating in my spirit, which has its own virtues. But so it's not easy. First of all, even when you want to do it, how do you do it it's done right? Like, for instance, I mentioned Jim Wallace. You know what Jim Wallace did for some years? He would go into inner cities and he would bring together the business leaders, the gang leaders, and the church leaders, and they'd make covenants, with each other, because inside the inner city, there are three important players: the gangs, who often control there, the churches, who have access to the people, and the civic and business leaders, who have access to jobs. And he would make them have covenants and so on, and sometimes be very, very effective in helping transform inner cities and so on. But he teaches courses of that at Harvard. I don't know how to do that, but it's just important that we push ourselves. I'll give you, I'll come back on that next week, but from Gutierrez, who's the father of liberation theology, but he always says this. He says, so that this isn't abstract. So you don't just say, I'm for the poor. He said, always have, now this is very practical, he says, always have at least one poor person in your life that you can name. So if you say to Gutierrez, I'm for the poor, he said, name me one. With a name. Is it Raymond? Is it Susan? Who is this poor person in your life? Well, the homeless. No, name me a homeless person. he always said, like have somebody concrete in your life, then at least one place you're getting the gospel to the streets, you know. And the other thing is, if you're the other thing that often puts Maguses off is that the causes oftentimes they don't come pure, you know. So you so you go on a march, but then they start smashing windows, and you say, well, I don't want to be connected with that, or so on. Or I know my brother said, I can't walk with pro-life anymore. I just can't do it. You know, he said they've morphed into this thing. So he said they've become too political. They've put the wrong faces to it. He says, I'm against abortion. I simply can't walk in pro-life anymore. You know, some can, but so it's difficult. Yours is the $100 million question.
Okay, thank you, Father Ron. Here's a question. Will you please describe what systems and powers have a claim on our lives in today's North American context? Let me repeat that. Will you please describe what systems and powers? Okay.
Okay, I wish I had a little more time to think about that, because I want to name some off the top of my head. But for instance, one of them is comfort and lifestyle, you know, and I say this sympathetically, you know. See, we have an incredible, and for the good, we have an incredible standard of living, you know. I mean, I'm a priest of a vow of poverty, but, you know, I can't pretend to be poor. I can try to live simply and so on. But, you know, we have clean houses, and we shower every day, and we have the best foods, and our biggest problem is to keep our weight down or to get to the exercise gym and all kinds of stuff. That's an incredible lifestyle that more than 90% of the world can only envy, you know, but we're caught up in that, you know, so that, you know, we just had an experience 2 weeks ago off the storm here of losing some comforts where all of a sudden we don't have electricity, we don't have water, we don't have to eat our houses and so on. You know, see, but these become addictions. See, once I'm used to a certain way of life, once I'm used to be able to, I can shower every day, I can go to the gym when I want, I can do this stuff and so on. It is really hard to give that up, you know, and we fight for it. And oftentimes we'll sacrifice the poor, you know, or for instance, we'll sacrifice the environment. So we'll say, well, no, I need my electricity, I need my plastics, I need my boxes from Amazon. You know, don't get me wrong, nothing against Amazon, but there's only so much cardboard in the whole world, and it's going to be used up pretty quick. You know, so we get used to it, then we defend it. So that's one thing. But it's also just I mentioned before, the narcotic power of our culture, like pop culture, the way we're addicted now to information technology, where 80% of our population are looking at a screen all the time, which we're doing right now. You know, and so these are things that at a certain point we can't live without them, you know, and it's not even that they're bad. You know, it's not that, you know, I mean, there's our addictions that we shouldn't have, you know, drugs and excess alcohol and so on. That's bad, but comfort is a good thing. You know, poverty is a bad thing. You know, we should never idealize poverty. You know, in heaven, there's going to be no poor people. Poverty is something we're trying to eliminate on this planet, you know. And so, and we don't have to apologize for not being poor, you know, but see, it, at a certain point, as Berrigan said, it swallows us. It swallows us. So we can't. And then also, I'm going to name one last one. Kind of the short-sightedness of our culture. Again, not that it's bad, but our culture is predicated on youth, on health, and on today. You know, and if we're not young, or we're not healthy, or we lose our health, or whatever, we don't think long range. You know, and a lot of times young people make a lot of, you know, bad choices that, you know, are for the moment, but long term don't work, you know. But also it leaves us, you know, when I talked before about to have a foot outside the culture, like Berrigan says, I work in a cancer hospice, because that way I'm always working with people who are, they have no more foot in this culture. said, it gives me some perspective beyond the culture. He said, now prayer is supposed to do that. We're supposed to pray in such a way that, we keep connected outside the culture, but oftentimes our prayer life isn't strong enough. So he says, then do things like connect yourself to street people, to the homeless, to the dying, to somebody who has no place in this culture, or even a lot of people go to monasteries and visit monks, who chant in the middle of the night, that's countercultural, and it helps them. He said, there's something outside of our culture. See, our culture, it tends to absorb us completely, and then it makes us only this world oriented, and oftentimes more selfishly oriented. I got to protect my comfort. I got to protect my lifestyle, and when I've done that, whatever extra I'll give away.
Okay. Thank you, Father Ron. This one says, there's been discussion recently about current movements, for example, Black Lives Matter, but the discussion always points out their lack of basis in Jesus. For example, the 60s human rights movement. The question, do you see any potential for true prophecy in any of these movements, despite this obvious lack of Jesus as a basis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me answer it this way. See, we make a distinction, and I should have made that distinction clearer here. There is a distinction between Christian prophecy and political action. See, what things like Black Lives Matter do, is they can be really good there, or if you're pro-life, the pro-life movement or so on, they can be powerful political movements, and that doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. See, politics is politics. We got to find ways of living together to get fairer, so Black Lives Movement is very important to try to bring more just structures to our society, and so at a certain point it can be purely political. I mean, it's prophetic in terms of that it's justice for the poor, but then it doesn't have to try to cloak itself with Jesus, so Black Lives Matter doesn't say I'm coming out of Jesus or out of Buddhism or Muhammad and so on. I'm just coming out of justice and so on, and so that's legitimate, But then the second thing is, and we need to accept that, whenever you have a massive political movement or even a massive ecclesial movement, you're always going to have an underbelly, so and that can be tough to accept. So I said, someone says, well, I can't march with them because some of the people are breaking windows. Well, 95% of them aren't breaking windows, but then it seems like it jeopardizes and taints the whole thing and so on. See, so you have to with that's political, and it's important, and sometimes we have to, we're citizens of both worlds, city of God and the city of man, so we have to also be political and so on. But then when we have this, we have to accept the fact that it's going to be messy and there's going to be less than purity in it, which is also true in the church. I mean, God, the church is a great institution. I think it's a salvific institution for the world, but there's also a lot of sin in the church, and there's a lot of bad stuff done in the name of church. Church has hurt a lot of people. It's abused a lot of people and so on, and that's wrong. But we don't say, well, then because of that, I give up on the church. So these movements, and the same with the ecological movement, and a lot of the other movements, the cancel culture movement, and these just all these are political movements, and we have to kind of support what's good in them, and sometimes swallow hard, and say, well, it's Black Lives Matter. It's a very important moral movement, but there's going to be some underside to it, the same with anything. It's like Milan Kundera, who's a Czechoslovakian writer, is one of my favorite writers. But he always calls it the Great March. Whenever you have slogans and banners and so on, he calls it the Great March. And all these great marches are always dangerous. They can also be, they can also crucify Christ. Christ was crucified by a crowd. It's interesting in the New Testament, in the Bible, pardon me, in the Gospels, scholars will tell you that whenever the word crowd is used, the crowd, you could always add the word mindless. In the Gospels, crowds are always pejorative. Okay.
Thank you, Father Ron. I think we've touched on the questions here that everyone's asked.